Hey guys, just a real quick video here to highlight a couple of things that were raised on the Metal Audio Engineers Facebook group. One of the questions a couple days ago was regarding phase between kick and overheads when you're editing, and whether or not you can edit the kick separately from the rest of the kit. The other was about using drum samples, in particular room samples, to help make a live recording sound a bit more polished and professional when you don't have a good quality live drum take. So I just thought I'd make a video to highlight both of these things. I happened to be working on a session a couple weeks ago for a local punk band where I used both of these strategies. So I'll just go through them. First we'll talk about the kick and editing with respect to the overheads, and then I'll show you how I'm using drum samples to kind of fix the poor audio recording of the drums. So in the first example, you can see here I've got some drum tracks. I didn't record this this session. I just got the stems to mix, and I got overhead, kick, hi-hat, snare, 2 toms, and that's it. So no room mics, nothing like that. You can see here if I kind of blow up the waveform a bit, the audio was really quiet in most of the tracks to begin with, which didn't help, and then just the difference between the peaks on the snare hits versus the hi-hats were very close in dynamics, and just a ton of cymbal bleed and hi-hat bleed. So I decided to eventually to just replace the shells completely, but you'll see here that I also didn't edit the kick. And actually I did edit the overheads, but I've since consolidated that track, so that's why you don't see my edits up here. But basically, if you just zoom in here, you can see there's a lot of quick double kick parts, and rather than keying off of both the kick and the snare, I'm just keying off of the snare for my edits. And the reason is, even if I had mixed these drums entirely using the live tracks, you don't really need to hear the kick and the overheads, right? And certainly in the other tracks it would just be bleed as well. So while certainly there would be some phase discrepancies between where the kick transients are versus where they are in, say, the overhead track, you're never going to hear that in the context of the mix, right? So my strategy with this track was basically just to edit all of the drum tracks with the exception of the kick, and then I took the kick, and actually I'll show you this. I have this Legacy plugin, which I don't know if you can find anymore, but it's called the Massey DTM Drum to MIDI plugin. And what it allows you to do is basically highlight a selection, analyze it. It'll detect the transients, and then you can generate a MIDI file. So I actually, I'll just make a MIDI track here quickly so you can see this. So what I did is I took the MIDI from this performance and basically just dropped this onto an instrument track. And I did that for each of the shells. I did that for the snare and the tom tracks as well. And then I basically just worked in MIDI at that point. So I quantized all of that performance information on this Slate drum track. And obviously it's a little easier to work with MIDI to get things lined up just using quantization, and actually the DTM plugin does a good job of maintaining the dynamics so that you get a bit more realism out of the performance. So I'll actually just play this for you so you can hear the track. It's been a few minutes here and you haven't even heard anything, so let's just listen to it. I think it sounds pretty realistic, and then I'll just show you how the drum samples are working in conjunction with the overheads to create a fairly a real drum sound. Okay, so basically all I've got in from the live track is the overhead track. So I'll just solo the overheads for you. Okay, so there's a enormous high pass filter on these. I'll just show you that as well. So I've got most of right up to 760 hertz sucked right out of the overheads. And obviously, if you were trying to mix something a little more ambient, this probably wouldn't work too well. But with a fast, like 220 BPM punk mix, with distorted guitars, certainly for any metal type stuff, you can get away with that. And as long as you get that shine and kind of realism out of the top end of the overheads, it does work. So then I'll just solo the whole drum kit. Let's just listen to that together. Okay, so I mean, it sounds pretty real. I know there's, I'm sure if you had a very well recorded drum kit, it would sound perhaps better, but it does sound pretty good, especially within the context of the mix. And if I just pull out the overheads, you'll hear that everything else is completely fake. But the room mics in particular help to make this sound a bit more realistic. So let's listen to just the shells. And then if I just solo the room, you'll hear that the room itself is kind of what's giving that realistic ambience. And it's nice too because there's no cymbals, so you can really squash the rooms, and you don't need to cut out some of that high-end cymbal that you would have in a real room mic. You just get to hear the shells, and you can really compress them and get a lot of that ambience out of them. Okay, so hopefully that helps. I can probably go into more detail if anybody's interested about how to actually mix this type of stuff, but that's basically how I go about editing and setting up the drum samples in conjunction with the overheads to come up with a fairly realistic drum sound.